define racism. Some of you might have heard me before, so there's nothing new here. But everywhere I go, I have to begin here because the more I talk and listen and pay attention to what is going on, the more I realize that we still lack a structural understanding of racism. Yeah? White's definition of racism is something like the irrational beliefs some people have about the presumed inferiority of others. And I have to confess that we in the social sciences are not much better. That is sort of the definition that we have. Yeah? Slightly more jargon, but it's basically the same definition.
In part 1, we explored how the formula power plus prejudice equals racism was not actually created by sociologists, rather by activists with the express purpose of shutting down conversation. But how did it slink into the field of sociology? Well, one of the first advocates to advocate for the transition was a guy named David Wellman. His book, Portraits of White Racism, is entirely an argument for redefining racism as P+P = R. However, he is talking about in the field of sociology, not common use, and his reasons for this are based entirely around how sociologists study racism. So how anyone can cite this as reason for why it should apply to the normal population doesn't make any sense. But they do. This book is about white racism. Unlike most books on the subject, however, it is not about prejudice. For reasons that I make clear in the second chapter, I find that concept troublesome. It does not adequately explain the pervasiveness and subtlety of racist beliefs in American life. Thus, instead of assuming that racist sentiments are expressed as prejudice, I explore an alternative. Racism can mean culturally sanctioned beliefs which, regardless of the intentions involved, defend the advantages whites have because of the subordinate position of racial minorities. Already off to a great start, as he says one's intention doesn't matter in determining whether someone is racist. Viewed through these lenses, racism need not be restricted to the obvious hostilities expressed by bigots, nor found solely among the ranks of lower and working class people. That seems pretty classist. It is seen to be more pervasive, existing throughout the American class structure. So already right at the beginning, we can see that Wellman's intentions are the same as Biddle and Cates's. Let's change the definition of racism in order to change the way people think about it. Traditional instruments used by sociologists in large-scale surveys are not yet sensitive to these manifestations of racism. So at the time of writing, sociologists couldn't measure what he defines or wants to redefine as racism, which is a little bit more than convenient, since that means we can't test his claims at all. The structured questions asked in highly systematic research designs also assume a great deal of knowledge about the subject before the questions are posed. Since we know relatively little about the face of racism that I am exploring, traditional sociological methodologies are not much help. In fact, they probably get in the way of understanding. Thus, my research departs from orthodox procedures. Just in case you had any skepticism, we can see that Wellman's redefinition attempt is based around this idea he has that sociologists have to study racism in a different way. Again, it is motivated reasoning. And just how convenient it is that his new way requires him to not use the same standards everyone else has been using up until this point. The arguments made in this book are not based on statistical proof. I do not pretend to measure how widespread the racism I am analyzing is, nor do I assess the quarters in which it is most prominent. The purpose of this book is not to show how racism is distributed throughout the population. In fact, since the data was not collected in a random sample, that is not possible. Thus, I have neither the basis nor the reason to use statistical evidence. What this book does provide are the tools and the perspective with which to see racism and sentiments that are usually considered non-racist. That is possible with the data at hand. Now let's break down what he just said, because it's actually pretty crazy. He just said, that the accepted methods that sociologists used at the time to measure things could not measure what he defines as racism. So that means that the accepted methods would say that Wellman is wrong. So Wellman is essentially saying, hey, I'm not wrong, the accepted methods are wrong. We have to redefine racism so those methods will show what I believe is true.
Am I so out of touch? No, it's the children who are wrong.
And I'm basing this all not on statistical evidence or proof. I'm challenging the accepted methodology of sociologist based on 5 interviews I did as a student. Wow, wow, wow. The origin of P+P=R should really be called Motivated Reasoning, the movie. Now, this book was originally written in 1977. However, it was re-released in the 90s with a new preface he wrote at the time. And it perfectly illustrates how Wellman admits that his motivation for changing the definition of racism is all in order to justify his perspective of reality. A significant black middle class has emerged. Largely as a result of the 1960s civil rights activities, economic well-being was achieved by a sizable portion of the black community throughout the 1970s and 1980s. By 1981, the proportion of black Americans who enjoyed an income that supports a middle-class lifestyle exceeded 40%. So far, this all sounds like good news, right? Like the country is moving forward in a positive direction. As a consequence, some sociologists argue that class forces and economic factors are more important variables than white racism for explaining the social location of African Americans. The significance of racism, according to this view, has declined in the last 2 decades. But if I believe that, it would mean I was wrong! New scholarship has been produced that sociology of racism has become more sophisticated. Many sociologists now locate the situation of African Americans in an institutional rather than a psychological context, and much less energy is devoted to analyzing racial prejudice among whites. Instead, the focus is on culture, ideology, and discursive strategies. Racial issues are therefore grounded in a more complicated intellectual environment. It's almost like if you look at the advancements the black community has made, one would have to shift the focus and definition of racism in order to argue that its prevalence is anywhere near what it once was. And in case you thought me going through all the sociology definitions in the first video wasn't enough, here Wellman is even complaining about the sociological definition. In contrast, the meaning of racism is currently being disputed. Some sociologists say the concept has been inflated, and one of them writes that this book has contributed to that conceptual inflation. The word racism is also presently used in conflicting and apparently contradictory ways. William J. Wilson is the most prominent proponent of the structuralist path. Persistent joblessness and poverty among inner-city black Americans, in his view, cannot be explained by contemporary racism. Oh my god. It's current year! Who is this guy saying all these horribly racist things? Oh. Wilson's analysis is echoed by an emerging chorus of social scientists who argue, as Alan Wolf states, the case that the most fateful and interesting developments have been taking place not between the races, but within one of them. Like Wilson, his imitators minimize the continuing impact of racism on American life because they define racism narrowly as an irrational psychological problem manifested by misinformed white Americans. They are unable to connect urban poverty to more complicated and subtle understandings of the problem. So Wellman has decided that to counter them defining racism too narrowly, he's just going to redefine racism in a way that makes it so it can't be ignored, because it exists in literally every facet of American life. This sounds like an objective and honest approach to trying to understand reality. I think you're ignoring something, so let me just redefine it so it becomes unignorable and inherent in everything. To argue that race matters does not mean, as some sociologists claim, one must demonstrate that prejudice, in the old-fashioned sense of the term, persists unchanged in American culture. That is not necessary. It's not necessary if you redefine the word racism, nor does it mean one must show deliberate ill will is reemerging. You know, because I specifically defined it to be that way. Now this next part gets a little weird, and it really shows you where Wellman's thinking is. Thus, because race still counts and resources are finite, the relationship between black and white Americans remains very much the zero-sum arrangement it was 15 years ago when the first edition of this book was published. The arithmetic is simple. As blacks gain chances, whites lose certainty. So here's an idea. Instead of redefining racism to make it exist in all facets of American life, why aren't you working towards dismantling the black-white identity and pushing for a unified American identity? Then there wouldn't be this racial struggle for resources as you claim. Because all you're doing is giving the alt-right more ammunition and furthering the racial divide. And in case you think I'm misrepresenting Wellman by saying he's intentionally trying to do this in order to change the outcome of sociological studies, he literally says it. How sociologists define a problem is directly related to the conclusions they reach. If the attitudinal dimension of racism is defined as explicitly racial, hostile, and inaccurate, that is what will be found. In case you had any doubt in your mind that Wellman wasn't acting purely out of motivated reasoning, he literally says that changing the definition will change the conclusions that people reach. Studies of racism guided by this conception have been severely limited. They have been able to focus only on those attitudes having the characteristics of prejudice, and if these were the only kinds of racially motivated attitudes, then the limitation would not be a liability. It would accurately mirror racial feelings in America. However, it has become increasingly obvious in recent years that many American attitudes about racial issues are not expressed in obvious ways, do not reflect hostility, and are not always misjudgments of the problem. How exactly is it increasingly obvious if you can't measure it? These kinds of attitudes, however, cannot be detected or adequately interpreted as long as racial feelings are conceptualized as prejudice. So what Wellman is saying is that because American attitudes about race issues are not expressed overtly, it must mean that all the Americans are just secretly being racist. It's not possible that they could be motivated for reasons that have nothing to do with racism. This goes beyond the power of psychic mind-reading dog whistles. Here he's saying that your intention literally doesn't matter. Purely by existing, you are racist. Wellman wants to make racism America's original sin. Thus, the sociological net with which we go fishing for racist is really capable of catching only those whose racial facts differ from our own. When we catch people like ourselves, we are without a systematic theory to explain why they are in our net. But our usual catch of prejudiced people has been limited to poor and working class people, the Archie Bunkers. They're the people who, because of their class origins, have either not learned the proper ways of presenting racial views to sociological questioners or find middle-class ideals about race relations irrelevant to their situation. So what Wellman is saying is that all the middle and upper class racists are just smart enough to hide their racism in acceptable terms. And because he's a psychic mind reader, he's saying that we just have to change the definition of racism so we can catch all these sneaky people lying about their racism. And on top of all of that, Wellman is acting like we don't have words to define the concepts he's talking about. But we do. We do have the terms systemic and institutional racism. So instead of trying to gerrymander the term racism, so why not simply promote for sociologists to study systemic and institutional racism? It's not like people can't study very specific things. I mean, we're seeing that right now with all this studying into implicit racism, because that sounds nicer than psychic dog whistling. Prejudice has defended the status quo in the face of black demands for institutional reorganization. These whites say they are not hostile towards black people. Moreover, their defense of traditional arrangements is not based on misperception. So again, Wellman is motivated by the fact that he thinks white people who are racist are pretending to not be racist. And here Wellman gives us the perfect example of how his reasoning and redefinition of racism oversimplifies every situation as racism. In 1966, black and Puerto Rican leaders in East Harlem, New York City, demanded that their schools either be integrated or community controlled. The New York City School Board responded with an experiment that altered relationship of power over education in the city. The administration of schools was decentralized and community-run school boards were established in 3 predominantly black communities. In the fall of 1968, traditionally liberal white teachers went on strike, protesting the actions of the black unit administrator and his school board in one of these areas, Brooklyn, Ocean Hill, Brownsville Ghetto. The teachers did not express racial hostility towards the black administrator or the community board. Prejudice was not the issue, they argued. They felt their rights and interests as teachers were at stake. Their opposition to changes in the status quo was not articulated in racial terms. They defended their position and the status quo in the rhetoric of the preservation of professionalism. So what Wellman is saying is that the white teachers were able to protest against these changes and make themselves seem not racist by saying all the right things, even though these teachers were motivated by racism. But the problem is that Wellman's characterization of the protest is absurd. It really shines a light on how dangerous his thinking is. Because remember, Wellman wants to change the conclusions sociologists reach. What Wellman doesn't tell you is what reason the teachers gave for going on strike. Because to him, what they explicitly say doesn't matter, because he's already decided it's racially motivated. What started the strike was that the new board fired 83 white teachers, who were mostly Jewish, and the way in which they fired them violated their union contract with the city. The unilateral decision violated the rules of the union contract. The teachers were nearly unanimously Jewish. One black teacher included on the list, seemingly by accident, was quickly reinstated. So when a union does the thing it's literally designed to do, go on strike when the terms the employer and the union have agreed upon are broken, Wellman calls that racist. That's in-fucking-sane. If the union didn't go on strike, then there would be no reason for it to exist, and it may have well dissolved. This right here just perfectly encapsulates the danger of trying to force people to view everything through a specific lens, especially an everything is racist lens, which is exactly what Wellman is doing. And of course, while Wellman is so concerned about the implicit unspoken racism of these teachers, he ignores the explicit anti-Semitism surrounding the entire situation. Shanker, the head of the teachers union, distributed 500,000 copies of a pamphlet some of his members found behind the schools in dispute worded, "The idea behind this program is beautiful, but when the money changers heard about it, they took over, as is their custom in the black community." On December 26 of 1968, Julius Lester on WBAI radio interviewed Leslie Campbell, a history teacher, who read a poem written by one of his students entitled Anti-Semitism, dedicated to Albert Shanker, that began with the words, "Hey Jew boy, with that yarmulke on your head, you pale-faced Jew boy, I wish you were dead." The poem then goes on to say the author is sick about hearing about the Holocaust because it only lasted 15 years compared to the 400 years blacks had been suffering. Proving that old adage, it doesn't matter what side of the spectrum you fall on, everyone hates the Jews.
Because they're jealous.
Opposition to these reforms is rarely stated in explicitly racial terms. The issue, argue supporters of continued police autonomy, is efficiency, standards, and the facilitation of normal operations. Middle-class white Americans who oppose school busing to achieve racial balance rarely voice their opposition in racial categories. They tell us they are concerned with buses, not blackness. The issue is that children spend too much time in transit. In institutions of higher education, the situation is not much different. A racial vocabulary is not used by professors who oppose open enrollment programs or black study departments. They say they are concerned that these programs will lower academic standards. Wellman is clearly explaining that he wants to change the definition of racism in order to win what he thinks are the word games that racists play. He wants to define racism so that everyone is racist just so that he can win these ideological arguments with people. That's it. The terms in which middle-class professionals defend traditional institutional arrangements are, strictly speaking, not examples of racial prejudice. They are neither overtly racist nor, given these people's interest, misinterpretations of facts. However, while the sentiments may not be prejudiced, they justify arrangements that, in effect, if not in intent, maintain the status quo and thereby keeping blacks in subordinate positions. Whether the demands and responses are legitimate or illegitimate is not an issue here. So your reasons don't matter. All that matters is the outcome. The question is whether implementation of black demands would decrease the unequal relationship between blacks and whites. If the consequence of whites acceding to black demands reduces black-white inequality, and if whites choose to oppose it, then regardless of the principle invoked, the opposition perpetuates the status quo. So what Wellman is saying is that even if you have a completely legitimate reason to oppose some kind of social reform, like with the previously talked about teachers' union example, if that social reform aims to decrease the perceived unequal relationship between blacks and whites, then you're a racist. The concept of prejudice is meaningless in this context. If people who claim the right to discriminate are not prejudiced, of what use is the concept? If both the prejudiced and the unprejudiced claim the right to discriminate in private affairs, the concept explains nothing about racism. Sociologists writing prior to the late 1960s were relatively optimistic that racial barriers in the United States would be undermined. The influence of racism on one's social position was expected to decrease. Wait a minute. It did decrease! You just refused to allow new information to change what you've already decided. Most sociologists assumed America was a loosely structured, relatively open society which promoted upward mobility for groups that were properly motivated. So of course, when after the civil rights movement, everything didn't change fast enough, people like Wellman went into a tizzy and decided they had to be activist academics and try to trick people into doing the right thing. Now in this next part, I am really bothered by Wellman seemingly trying to not get rid of racial differences and racial struggles, but rather emphasize them. There is another approach to white racism. If we view it as a culturally sanctioned, rational response to struggles over scarce resources, we can account for its widespread character and avoid the inconsistencies and meaningless distinctions that arise when it's viewed as prejudice. Categorizing it as meaningless distinctions is how we get into these everything is racist and sexist because of the way I view the world mental trap. The analogy of a zero-sum game is appropriate. For blacks to gain may mean whites will lose. White people thus have an interest in maintaining their position of racial advantage. The issues that divide black and white people then are grounded in real and material conditions. The justification for this division, moreover, have an element of rationality to them. Okay, so if you believe that, wouldn't your goal from a pragmatic level be to try and disassemble racial identities so that Americans no longer viewed themselves as white or black? If people didn't put importance on black or white identity, then obviously they couldn't view themselves on some sort of resource struggle based on skin color. But for some crazy reason, Wellman doesn't advocate for that. Sociologists don't even believe in race being biological at all. So why isn't this guy trying to get rid of it? Thus, in varying ways, all white Americans have formulated strategies for justifying their privileged position. Analyzing racism as a defense of privilege permits detection of it among all, not just a few, Americans. So here Wellman is explicitly admitting, if we redefine the way we look at racism according to my terms, then we can just call every American racist, then we don't have to deal with all the people claiming they're not racist. This is insane levels of group responsibility. It's like, imagine if there were a gang of hoodlums in a specific community that were causing trouble, and the police said, well, we can't figure out who specifically in this community is part of the gang, so we're just gonna blame all of you and hold every single person here responsible. Yeah, that sounds like a real great idea. That's definitely a concept that's never been used against minorities. This is what happens when you have people that don't care at all about intellectually consistent thinking. They simply want what they want. Logic, reason, and fairness be damned. Racism extends considerably beyond prejudiced beliefs. The essential feature of racism is not hostility or misperception, but rather the defense of a system from which advantage is derived on the basis of race. The manner in which the defense is articulated articulated, either with hostility or subtlety, is not nearly as important as the fact that it ensures the continuation of a privileged relationship. Thus, it is necessary to broaden the definition of racism beyond prejudice to include sentiments that are in their consequence, if not their intent, support the racial status quo. So there you have it.
It's all there, black and white, clear as crystal.
This idea of power plus privilege equals racism is not based on facts, or reason, or intellectual consistency. None of those terrible white people empirical values. It's not a natural change that occurred over a period of time in the general public. No, P+P = R is a concerted effort by a group of activists who explicitly state they want to be able to redefine everything as racism in order to trick people to being motivated to fight what they define as racism. This is all based on trying to win ideological arguments by simply defining the terms in a way that they can't be argued against. Even if you're in favor of this definition of racism, you can't deny how utterly dangerous it is to allow any side of a debate to simply redefine a word in a way to instantly make themselves the winner of that debate, because there's nothing that's stopping those who are against you from doing the same thing. Imagine if there was some conservative academic group that was involved in, I don't know, the study of guns and religion, and they said, oh, we've decided to change the definition of patriot to mean someone who votes Republican. But don't worry, Democrats can still be good Americans, they just can't be patriots. I highly doubt the P+P = R people would be on board with that ideological redefinition attempt. What if the libertarian academics of the study of roads tried to redefine the word taxation to mean theft? Would they be on board with that? Because that's literally what the P+P = R is. It's just trying to redefine a word to win an argument. And this is psychotically dangerous, because we live in a society where most of us agree that we should solve our problems by words and by law. And if you have a group of people who, even with the best of intentions, are trying to get institutions of power to change the definition of a word in order to win an argument, you're taking away the ability to solve problems through words. And that means is that people are suddenly going to have to rely on something else. Something that people have been doing for hundreds of thousands of years. Something called violence. You know who just totally loves when people advocate for P+P = R? The alt-right. All you're doing is emphasizing racial identity. And if you do that, white people are suddenly going to say, hey, all these non-white people are using their racial identity to get power in society. I guess I need to start using my racial identity to get power too.
I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
I can only imagine that those on the far left advocating for this are simply naive, and they think because the world they live in right now, white guilt is a powerful enough tool that they can get away with racism towards white people. They think because that's the world they live in right now, that that's the way it will always be. Well, here's the wake-up call. It won't. And if you keep pressing this, if you keep poking this bear, it will only lead you to ruin. It will only cause white people to become more racist. It'll only cause white people to want to unify using their racial identity. And considering that most of you believe that white people still hold the majority of power in this country, doesn't seem like the brightest of ideas. You are literally doing the alt-right's work. This is why I am totally against this thinking. It's not because I'm really a secret racist, it's because I see where this is going and they don't. It's because I'm not limiting my view of people and the world to this tiny time period where white guilt and social justice has control over the mainstream. And it's completely naive to think this can't turn on a dime. This is what people mean when they say the far left helped get Trump elected, because people are getting tired of this. And for my loyal viewers who have made it to the end of this video, remember to shove this in anyone's face the next time they bring up P+P=R. Well, who are we kidding? They're not gonna actually watch this. Who wants to watch 2 long-ass videos where someone obnoxiously tells you how wrong you are? Instead, when they bring up P+P=R as being an academic definition, you can simply say, P+P=R is a contested definition created by activists in order to push an ideological agenda. And when they ask you for proof, then you slap them with the video. And you know they're not gonna watch it, so you can just declare victory. I mean, yeah, it's not gonna change their mind, but at least you'll feel good about it.
I think the lesson here is that I need to win this! I want to win! And you suck! You're stupid, ugly, poopy, and I'm better than you!
Now, one important question remains. Why now? Why is P+P=R making such a comeback when it seemed to be a discarded idea from the 1970s? Well, part of it is just the overall resurgence of SJW ideas that mostly all come from the same time period, but it's also because of this man,
Eduardo Bonilla Silva,
who is the current head of the American Sociological Association, and he's made his entire career on P+P=R types of rhetoric. Here's him complaining that sociologists don't use P+P=R.
White's definition of racism is something like the irrational beliefs some people have about the presumed inferiority of others. And I have to confess that we in the social sciences are not much better. That is sort of the definition that we have, yeah? Slightly more jargon, but it's basically the same definition.
And here's him saying something completely insane.
What is the plot of the movie about? Hancock has powers. He finds this white woman who he seems to be attracted to, and she seems to be attracted to him. They are about to kiss, and then she smacks him. And he's a superhero, and he gets a super smack. So all of a sudden, we realize she's a superhero too, and that they had been together in the past. So the plot of the movie goes. But they realize that if they're together, their powers decrease. Therefore, the conclusion of the movie, let me spoil it for you all who didn't see it. The conclusion of the movie is these folks are happy when they are far apart because both of them have regained their powers. That's a way of reinforcing the racial order of things in a creative Hollywood way.
That's right! I bet you didn't realize that Hancock was secretly about the dangers of
You miscegenated! All you boys is miscegenated! These boys is not white. Hell, they ain't even old-timey!
Instead of doing another video on just him, I'm going to do a live stream, or 2, on this channel with Friended Forever, where we'll go over his horrible speaking engagements and break them down. So until then... I got loads of fan art! Tony, jumping on the Bowsetta craze, made a quite lovely version of me. Exofrats captures me as I contemplate what dumb memes to throw into a video, as well as discovering that The Sims is secretly using my image without permission. Bisharp shows how angry I get when someone incorrectly calls me Stitch. And Evianon has me going Super Saiyan Blue. David Argon has me and Friended, defending St. Jordan Peterson, as we are part of the official JP Internet Defense Force. Gory Relay Hotep shows just how versatile my face can be as it's fixed in its permanent frown. James Rookrabbit has perfectly shown how I feel after a long day of writing these dumb scripts. Writing scripts for these wonderful videos, as well as depicting me as a fairy godparent. And also here I am inspecting everyone's favorite dog whistle. Sheepless Dreamer having me spring into action, as well as wearing everyone's favorite peach crown. And this little guy. Some pyromancer made me an Undoomed clone, or rather just pointed it out, and Dirk Squarejaw has me after a long night of drinking. Or maybe he was drinking. Or maybe I'm a sock puppet. BooFire191 has me busting out Cyclops' optic lasers, as well as everyone's favorite hero, All Might. He's got a YouTube channel, so go check it out. Taco Sunrise somehow got a leaked poster for the brand new live-action version of Lilo and Stitch. And Dracona the Wolf has me as, well, a werewolf. He's also got a YouTube channel, so make sure you check it out. Reg and Amber has me chilling out on a nice tropical beach, which is definitely what I do in between videos and not sit in my room on Twitter all day. Benjamin Boyce made this funny little video of me. He's also got a great YouTube channel, so make sure you check it out. And last but definitely not least is Felix and Caffeine Tweaker, who have made so much art of me and Friended that I can't even talk about it, only display it in all its beauty and glory. And if there's anyone who sent me a picture that I either didn't respond to or didn't show in a video, please just send it again, because it's very possible I either didn't get it or didn't realize I haven't shown it yet. Until the next one, bye for now.